When you click on the drop-down menu to add a layer, you can see that there's a lot more options than just paint and vector. We're going to look through some of these other options in this video. First, let's consider the stack order in the layers docker. When you think about how a painter works, they put down their base paints first, their background sky layer, and then mountains, and then the forests up close. If you've ever watched a Bob Ross video, you'll know what I'm talking about. Krita effectively does the same thing, but lets you separate all of those layers out so that you can manipulate them individually. You can hide and reveal layers by clicking on the eye icon. In this case, you can see that I've already cut out the red chassis of this car and put it on its own layer so that we can manipulate it in this video. When you hover over a layer, it gives you a little preview of what's on it. If you want to isolate a layer, you can right-click and click on Isolate Active Layer, and this will mean that you only see the layer that you're currently working with, and these white and grey squares represent alpha transparency. I've set a hotkey to isolate layers as Tab, but this isn't implemented in Krita by default. To set this hotkey yourself, go to Settings, Configure Krita, Keyboard Shortcuts, and then type ISO. Then for Isolate Active Layer, click off the default onto Custom, and then put whatever you want. Then just press OK. Let's start off by grouping layers. So if we were to, for example, press Shift and select all of these layers that we've got above the photo, and then press Ctrl G, it creates a group. Now if we isolate with the group layer selected, you can see that my image credit and the chassis have been isolated together. In order to edit whilst in isolate layer mode though, you have to select an actual layer rather than a group. Group layers aren't just useful for organization, they also let you apply filters within a group. As an example, if I add a bunch of color on this paint layer with my brush, and let's say that I wanted to do some recoloring of this photo now. To do this, I would go to Filter, and then choose whichever filter I want. For example, HSV Adjustment. This brings up a preview window, and you can use this to shift the colors that I've painted onto the scene. You can change saturation, brightness, all of that sort of stuff. Let's say I'm happy with these edits, and then I press OK. This edit is then destructively applied to the paint layer. And you can see if I isolate the layer, then the edit has been made permanent. If I were to save this now and close Krita, these edits really would be permanent. But at the moment, I can undo this with Ctrl Z. To make this edit non-destructive, I should have instead applied the filter as a mask. This creates a new layer named after the filter that's a child of the paint layer. The other way of doing this would be to create a filter layer. Here you get a slightly different pop-up, but most of the filters that you can apply are all the same. We can make the same edit and then press OK. But the problem here now is that this filter is applying to everything below it in the stack. So you can see the color of the car chassis and the people's skin tones has also changed. To avoid this, we can put the paint layer and the filter layer in a group together. Now, only the paint is being color changed. This works very similarly to a mask. Honestly, I think it's just user preference whether you prefer to use filter layers in groups or to use filter masks. In general, I think it's better to use less layers and groups if you can, so the filter mask method is probably preferable, but won't matter unless you're working with a really big file. Now, with these things separated out, I can apply a different filter. For example, a halftone filter. There's a lot of options in here, so I'll just go with the default and create it as a filter mask. You can also change the opacity of each layer individually. So if I wanted this halftone mask to be more of a texture, then I could lower the opacity on it, and the red of the original stock photo would still come through. However, there's an even better way of doing this in combination with opacity, which is to use blending modes. When you click on blending modes, you're given a whole host of different options. The meanings of each of these options is a little ambiguous, so I generally find it's easier to just hover your mouse over the blending mode and scroll with your wheel to look through all of the different available options. If we bring the opacity back up, then we can see these options more clearly. Filter layers are technically using the copy blending mode and then applying the filter mask to that instance of the layer. But groups can have blending modes as well. For example, using the color HSL blending mode, this will make just the colors that we've used in this group get applied to what's underneath without any of the paint texture itself. Next up is the clone layer. This will basically make a copy of whatever layer you had selected when you created it. The clone layer counts as a raster layer, which means that this can be a very useful way of, for example, non-destructively rasterizing text. The clone layer can't be manipulated directly, and so instead you have to add a transform mask. This will then allow you to change the size and move it around. But the advantage here is that we can now edit the original vector layer that it's based on. For example, we could change this to .png, and the clone layer will update. We can now even hide the original vector layer. We could add a filter layer to this as well to edit it further. So if we put it in a group, and then add a filter layer, and then add some Gaussian blur, say. The deeper the grouping and the layer masking and filter layers go, the more difficult it gets to update stuff. So for example, if we were to skew this transform mask, you can see it's updating a bit slower now. This is because it's trying to apply not just the clone layer, but also the filter layer to this transformation. But the beauty of having it in this non-destructive arrangement is that I can still go back to the original text and write in whatever I want. One thing to be aware of, though, is that any edits you make to this original layer that is being cloned will also carry over into the clone. So if we move the position of this, it's also going to move within the transform mask. And this can get quite confusing, especially if you crop the image afterwards. You may find that something gets cut off that you didn't intend to get cut off. This is a masterpiece. This is my finest work of art yet.